Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go slowly here because the numbers are ticking up. More people are joining as I'm talking. So I'm going to wait a couple of minutes and then we're going to get started. Great. Okay, apparently once you open up the room, it takes a long time for this many hundreds of people to join. So people are still joining, but I think I'm going to get started. Hi, Tim. Hi, Gordon. Thank you for joining. It's going to be an exciting conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Great to be here.
So welcome everybody to Citizen Oil, how oil lobbyists are hiding behind the maple leaf to protect their profits. Checking to see if we have a slowdown in the numbers. It looks like, oh no, still more people joining. I'm so glad so many people are interested in this conversation. That is awesome. So if you're here, you probably already know the oil and gas industry does much more than just dispatch lobbyists to Parliament Hill. In recent years, major oil companies have invested very heavily in building up pro-oil citizens' front groups, while allying with sympathetic politicians and journalists to attack environmentalists as illegitimate, foreign-funded, and un-Canadian. I know that extremely well. Premier Kenney, when he announced the war room, held up a picture of my head with a cross through it. No, I'm sorry. Someone from a pro-oil lobby group held up a picture of my head while he talked about the war against those who were threatening Canada. In the process of doing this, they're trying to twist the very definition of Canadian national identity around extractivist interests with echoes that could be heard in the Freedom Convoy. But behind all of their furious flag waving, big oil lobbyists are hiding a pretty dirty secret. The industry itself is overwhelmingly foreign owned. I'm Tzeporah Berman. I'm the International Program Director at Stand.earth. I'm also the chair of the Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations, where I'm honored to live and work. Today we have the honor of being joined by a number of experts in this field. But first I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So given that there are almost 200 and constantly growing, okay, that number keeps changing, there are several hundred participants in this webinar. The chat function will be disabled, but the discussion with our panelists will follow with a Q&A session. So if you have questions, you can put them at any time into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So you just press Q&A, you can put your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can submit your question to the panel, and we're going to do our best to answer as many as possible. So Gordon Laxer is a political economist, professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, and the founding director of the Parkland Institute, which is awesome. They've done so much good work over the years. I'm constantly going back to Parkland Institute reports. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, After the Sands, Energy and Ecological Security for Canadians and Open for Business, The Roots of Foreign Ownership in Canada. He's also the author of many refereed articles and reports, including Posing as Canadian, How Big Foreign Oil Captures Canadian Energy and Climate Policy. Tim Wood was born and raised in Alberta, but is now an assistant professor at Fordham University in the Department of Communication and Media Studies, where his research examines corporate grassroots lobbying in support of oil projects, investigating how citizens and companies come together to fight political battles. So excited to have both of you here today. Thank you for taking the time, and I'm so glad so many people from well across this country have joined us to talk about these issues. So let's get right into it. Gordon, Your report, Posing as Canadian, how big foreign oil captures Canadian energy and climate policy, really helped to spark tonight's conversation and many conversations. So let's just start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to write the report and what some of your major findings are?
Sure, happy to do so. Good evening. I am speaking from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Chippewas of Rama and the Ojibwa. Well, I was furious about the hypocrisy of the super rich big oil that is overwhelmingly foreign funded, waging a deceptive campaign, charging that Canadian environmental organizations were foreign funded and somehow un-Canadian. The truth is that Canadian environmentalists are overwhelmingly Canadian funded, but facts didn't matter. The accusations helped Jason Kenney's UCP party defeat Rachel Notley's NDP in the last Alberta election. Having lived in Alberta for 30 years, I was well aware of the oversized political influence of the big oil corporations on Alberta governments. And I was also aware that 2/3 of the world's climate pollution is caused by just 90 corporations, 7 of them big oil in Canada. Yet here was big oil intervening in Alberta's last provincial election. With huge profits on the line, big oil's apex lobby group, CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, demanded that Kenney counter what CAP called an anti-Alberta campaign waged by foreign-funded anti-pipeline activists. That's a quote from them. I wrote the Posing as Canadian report to unearth the hypocrisy and deception. Here were some of the richest corporations in the world portraying themselves as victims of grassroots environmentalists trying to save Canada and the planet. Jason Kenney's UCP party heard CAP's call loud and clear. And when they became government, they used taxpayer money to fund a $30 million a year war room, as they called it, to combat what they called misinformation about Alberta's energy. And they also set up a $3.5 million public inquiry into what they alleged was a foreign-funded conspiracy to landlock Alberta oil. And the inquiry was meant to discredit and undermine the credibility of Canadian environmentalists. It's a McCarthyist tactic. Accuse your opponents of wrongdoing and hope some of the dirt sticks. Well, tasked to investigate flows into the tar sands campaign, the public inquiry did not find that participation in an anti-Alberta energy campaign, as they called it, was in any way improper or constituted conduct that should in any way be impugned. It found no wrongdoing by any individual or organization. Indeed, they have exercised their rights of free speech. Well, what did the inquiry find? Well, it found a trickle of foreign funding between 2.2 and 3.4 million a year went into campaigns to curb oil sands production and emissions. Now that's peanuts. It's an annual sum smaller than in the increased $3.5 million budget. So why would you call an inquiry that is more expensive than what it's investigating? After the public inquiry issued its report, the Kenney government made wildly misleading statements about the size of the foreign funding of environmental organizations that the public inquiry found. Meanwhile, the Kenney government had targeted a molehill and missed the Rockies. Right under their noses was a far bigger source of foreign funding influencing Alberta and Canadian politics, big foreign oil. So what did my report find? Do we want to go into that? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You're on a roll.
Okay. Well, I had known that Calgary's oil patch was dominated by big foreign oil, but I didn't realize just how much it was. My report was the first to investigate the foreign ownership level of each corporation on CAP's board. We used Bloomberg terminals to get the data and found that the Canadianness of Calgary-based oil corporations was an inch deep. Of the 48 corporations on CAP's board, 30 were confirmed to be either fully or majority foreign owned, while the available data showed that 7 more were very likely majority foreign owned. So combined, that makes up 77% of CAP's board that was foreign owned. And the foreign owned corporations are the biggies, so much so that 97% of the oil produced on CAP's board comes from either fully or majority foreign owned corporations. That means that CAP is 97% foreign funded because CAP's corporate membership fees are based on each corporation's oil production level. So the Canadian owned oil corporations are puny, and they produced 3%, under 3% of the output on CAP's board. So here was CAP waging a very public campaign against the foreign funding of the Canadian environmental charities that were critical of the oil sands' outsized climate pollution. And Alberta's public inquiry found that those environmental groups got only a tiny amount of funding from foreign sources. For all its bravado, as a Canadian center of oil and gas in the world, Calgary is an outpost of big foreign oil that wields that power in Canadian politics as if they were Canadian citizens. And I want to remind everybody that corporations are not citizens. People are, and it's one person, one vote. Foreign big money has no business intervening in Canadian politics or the politics of any other country either. Well, CAP's playbook consists of 4 strands, which Tim and I will elaborate on. First, demonize your opponents as non-Canadian. Secondly, get out the energy vote. Third, summon an army of grassroots supporters to deflect from big oil's fat cat image. And finally, lobby and influence governments to defang regulation. In Alberta, whether Conservatives or the NDP held power, big foreign oil has had great sway over policies. Alberta acts as the chief political champion of oil and gas corporations in Canada, and even threatens to leave and talks about separation if they don't get their way. Overall, my report found that CAP is the biggest obstacle to Canada's ability to cut carbon pollution from this country's greatest and fastest growing source of emissions, that is the production of oil and gas, and it's not even mainly produced for Canadians' use.
It's fascinating. You know, it is actually my own lived experience. Some of you will remember that I sat on the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group for several years in Alberta. And one of the interesting things that I found is that when talking to individuals who work in the industry, there were a number of people who were really worried about climate change and really trying to honestly figure out how to transform their industry. And I think it's really important when we have this conversation that we remember that there are good people everywhere. Some of them really stuck in bad companies or bad systems. And so we would have these consensus-based discussions to try and come up with consensus-based recommendations to the government on how to implement the climate policy. And we'd reach agreement with a number of the company reps that were there. And then, you know, supporting the carbon price, it makes sense from an economic perspective. They said it'll even help us, those of us companies who are really trying to reduce emissions, and a number of other issues. And then the CAP would put out a position paper that was entirely different and attack the carbon price and attack the carbon tax. And we'd go back to the companies and say, well, wait a minute, we had like a year of discussions on this and we came up with these consensus-based recommendations, and we can't, CAP does what it wants. And we're like, you're on the board of CAP. And it was this fascinating thing where the individuals, you could tell the individuals themselves were and probably still are, I don't know, having, big tussles within their company, and that CAP was the one leading, the fight against climate policy. So that's really interesting that you bring it up that way. Let's go back into the inquiry in a minute. I want to make sure we got down those 4 strands, because that was really a great summary. So demonize opponents in Canada. Say them again. What were the 4?
Get out the energy vote.
Mm-hmm.
Summon an army of grassroots supporters to deflect from big oil's fat cat image. And finally, to lobby and influence governments in order to defang regulation. Great.
So helpful. That's so succinct. It really, I feel like it's that is entirely the lived experience of what we're all seeing. And so let's bring you into the conversation, Tim. This get out the energy vote and summon the army of grassroots. A lot of your research has been to study the ways that the oil companies try to mobilize citizens' support. So how long has the Canadian oil industry been using nationalism as a key message for gaining public support? And what's new in the way the oil companies are talking about Canadian identity?
Yeah, thanks, Tzeporah. I think Gordon sets us up really nicely with this conversation about the uses and abuses of national identity. I'm coming to you today from unceded Nipmuc, Pekumtuk, and Manatuk land. When I pause to think about that fact, it's a reminder that nation building and resource extraction have been used as linked rationales by settlers to dispossess people from land, since Europeans crossed the Atlantic en masse. So in a sense, this is a very, very old story. And in our discussion today, I hope we can lean on some of the knowledge of Indigenous folks and communities who have been facing this problem for a very long time. Some of the ideas I'm going to put out there are sort of shaped by reading people like Nick Estes or Winanolo LaDuke, who have a lot to teach us about this relationship between nationalism and extractivism. But to address your question, in a more grounded way, when did the Canadian oil sector start playing the national identity? From exactly day one. The first oil corporation to produce, refine, and market oil was called the Canadian Oil Company. It was founded in 1860, 7 years before Confederation. Even today, drive by a Petro-Canada station, and it's a reminder that the maple leaf has been wrapped around Canadian marketing of oil for a really long time. But I was thinking about this talk and sort of going through some old notes, and I came across something I want to share with everybody. It's a little scene that I think helps really paint this in stark relief. So I'm going to describe something that happened in 1986. And as I tell you this story, I want you to just tell me if this sounds familiar. So it's 1986. The global petroleum industry is immensely profitable, but the Canadian industry has had a downturn. Lots of people are losing their jobs in the oil patch. And in response, a large convoy of trucks driven by industry workers rolls up to a legislative building to hold a rally. During this rally, David Yeager, who was then, as now, the editor of an oil fields trade publication, stepped up to a microphone and gives a speech. And I want to quote a little bit of his speech. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the people gathered here today are not blue-eyed Arabs. They're not Americans. They're not Western separatists, nor are they political reactionaries, cowboys, or rednecks. These people are not going to shut off any taps so other Canadians go without oil or gas. The people here today are ordinary Canadians trying to defend their right to work." So this is 1986, and not only do we have a convoy protest, we get almost word for word the kind of rhetoric that Gordon's report so beautifully points out. And so the linkage between political advocacy, fossil fuels, and Canadian identity is not new at all. But what is new is that the structure and resources these campaigns get have become broader and deeper. This group in 1986 essentially put on a couple of protests and then disbanded and were never heard from again. But these organizations like Canada's Energy Citizens, which is run by CAP, have been running for 8 years straight. They started in 2014 and are ongoing. And so this effort to organize citizens is no longer this sort of one-off done in times of panic by the industry. It's now a 24/7, 365 endeavor and shows no signs of stopping.
Well, in some ways, you got to hand it to them for their message discipline, huh? Like 1986, it's one of the things we talk about a lot when we design campaigns in the environmental community world is how do we create an echo chamber? How do we create message discipline? And a lot of the theory of communications and social movement theory is that you have to build the message over time. You have to create a narrative journey we talk about. And it's and so we can see that from 1986, right? So building this constant drumbeat around be proud of what's happening, be proud of what we're doing, and anyone who's not is a anti-Canadian or a terrorist. And it's funny, our gut instinct, I think, in the environmental community world is to create more and more arguments. So it's like we have a message around science and why this is so important, and then we have a message around human rights around why this is so important, and then we have a report around, but we end up flooding the field and they just stay on this one message and build. It's an incredible lesson for me as a campaigner to think about that. So how are these pro-industry grassroots campaigns recruiting members in Canada today? And why would people choose these corporate-led campaigns?
Gordon, do you want to jump in?
No, I think you're best to do that, Tim.
All right. So, I mean, there's a lot of different campaigns and they all have slightly different strategies, right? We have Canada's Energy Citizens, Oil Sands Strong, Canada Action, more regional groups like BC Voices for LNG. So there's a lot of different people doing this a lot of different ways. But I love your question, Tzeporah. I think it's the right one to ask, because often we kind of dismiss all of this as front groups or AstroTurf, and we treat the people who join as, at best, kind of naive dupes, and at worst as like paid actors or something. And they aren't. They're very savvy people who have a real political investment in the outcomes of energy infrastructure battles that are going on in Canada. I've done a lot of interviews with these people over the years. This is kind of where my project started, which is going to talk to them about why they were doing what they're doing. And I think if there's one takeaway from those interviews that I hope people get, it's that the people who join these campaigns are not necessarily rabid ideologues. And they don't necessarily always show up because of their strong, arduous political feelings about oil. More typically, they join campaigns for the same reason that activists have been joining campaigns for years and years, and that social scientists have shown activists to join campaigns for years and years, is that they know somebody who's already doing it. They're brought in by their kind of social relationships with people. They have a college roommate who's now working at CAP, and they're doing it as a favor, or they start joining a conservative group on their campus who has an oil industry speaker come, who asks them to come to a couple of events or to be featured on the website. This is the way in, especially when these campaigns are nascent, when they're just starting out. This is how they build slowly a cadre of people they can depend on to show up at things and to really, be the face of these campaigns. And then once they get bigger and have been around for a while, they expand and they use more sort of online targeted advertising and things like this, databases to kind of keep track of who's a likely supporter and who's going to, show up at a rally, who's going to write a letter to their local legislature. But I really just want to emphasize the importance of the personal connections between people in building up these networks. And the other thing I would say is just people often join because of feelings of precarity, that they often have a connection, or at least a perceived connection to the industry, where they think that either their job or the welfare of the place that they live is somehow tied to the welfare of the industry itself. So I think those are the main motivating factors getting people into organizations like this.
It's really fascinating. And again, there are some lessons learned there in organizing for those of us working on social justice campaigns or environmental and climate campaigns and human rights campaigns. We so want people to be motivated by facts, that we often start, or even you see a lot of the campaigns out there that are just throwing out report after report. These facts will motivate people. But your answer reminds me of that amazing book by Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, where he talks about tribes, that people are motivated by opportunity. They're motivated by people they know. And there's a tremendous book on organizing, actually, by Jane McAlevey. I'll put a link in the chat, called No Shortcuts. And she talks about how organizing is really about relationships. It's about, and power is about those relationships and those numbers and organizing them. And I mean, there are some great social justice and environmental groups in the country who do this well. I think of Dogwood on the West Coast, or Lead Now, other groups like Stand, I think my own organization is doing some of this now, where we're really not treating lists just as funders, not treating people just as funders, but treating people as in their own right, and engaging them with each other in order to define what they're going to do in the organizing. So there's a sense of empowerment, there's a sense of community in these groups. They're real people joining a lot of these groups, and that's really important for us to remember. But it also does seem incredibly disingenuous when those groups are funded and really kickstarted by the extractivist money to protect their own vested interests. And that I think is part of the core differentiator, there between what is an AstroTurf and what is a grassroots group. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Although I would say that in practice, this binary is rarely an easy one. That a lot of these groups, get some funding from oil companies, and they also get some funding from other places. And a lot of these groups start very small and local, and then gain some funding maybe later on to amplify a message that they were already sort of putting out there. So, I think what I always say, like, terms like AstroTurf and Front Group are sharp political weapons, but dull analytical tools. They don't really help us see what these groups are doing. They sort of ask us to put them in the bin of bad actors and then forget about them. So as long as we're willing to sort of take the time and ask ourselves, why are people joining? What are these groups actually doing? And the other thing I would say is that the funding is becoming more open. Canada's Energy Citizens has a link to CAP at the bottom of their website. They're not ashamed of this anymore. And, we'll talk about this maybe more later, but it's much more transparent than it has been in the past in some ways.
I wanted to ask Tim a question. Do you think Canada's Energy Citizens would have started on its own without CAP sending out people to sort of start it up and help it go?
Canada's Energy Citizens started in the newsletter for CAP, which was aimed at people in the oil sector. Their first kind of like public foray was, we're going to go for the low-hanging fruit. We're going to go for people who work in this industry. If they won't speak up for us, who will? I think they really sort of started in a way where they thought, we'll go for the easiest people to get, the people who are most likely to join us, and sort of work from there.
So, and there's several impacts that we're talking about here, because one is the impact that all of these multiple groups and think tanks, et cetera, and the companies themselves and the associations can have on policy, holding back and watering down climate policy. And we've all seen the numbers now of, how many times the oil industry lobbies a government official in Ottawa, multiple times a day, versus how many times a government official actually meets with a scientist or an environmental organization. We're way outgunned there. But it strikes me that when you add the CAP lobby and the individual company lobby, and then the infrastructure, like the pipeline company lobby, and then these groups who are also doing lobby, you create this kind of ecosystem that is all saying the same message, so that has a huge influence. So there's one of the most interesting examples I saw just yesterday, there's an organization called Clear Seas that has come out with a report on marine ship scrubbers. And I actually, Stand.earth works on shipping and scrubbers. And so I, took a look at the report, and I was reading it, and I was really surprised, because all the scrubber reports I'm reading internationally are saying scrubbers are being used in order to allow heavy fuel oil in shipping. And you can use a lower distillate oil and have way less pollution. And so there's a number of jurisdictions around the world that have banned scrubbers. And therefore the ships are moving to a lower distillate fuel. But in Canada, we allow scrubbers, and so the ships use heavy fuel oil, and then the scrubbers just take the pollution that would have gone into the air and they dump it in the ocean. And so this particular report was mentioned some of the problems with toxic material in the scrubber wastewater, and then talked about things that the industry should be doing to change that. But in the recommendations at the end of the report, there was no recommendations on banning heavy fuel oil or banning scrubbers or even more regulations. It was all about what industry should be encouraged to do. And so then I started digging a little deeper, and sure enough, Clear Seas was started by CAP and the federal government and the Alberta government as an oceans campaign around what is good policy around shipping. But when it comes out as a report from the NGO Clear Seas on policy recommendations on scrubbers, it's, you don't know right away unless you do a little digging, which I did, who it is and who's funding. And I just thought it was a really good and very in the moment example. So lobbying influence, but then there's the political influence and the influence that these movements are clearly having on our politics and on making Canada more polarized, and pushing politics to the right. And I think those are two separate and distinct trends that should be in this conversation as we move forward. But before we do, I want to go back to something that we talked very briefly about, Gordon, around this war room, because it really is kind of the prime in your face example of a lot of what we're talking about. And you said in your research that really struck me. The annual sums of what they found was smaller than what they were spending on trying to find. I know because I was actually at the time for 6 years working to help design strategy on tar sands and pipelines for advocacy campaigns. And I was doing a lot of the funding and granting with philanthropists. That even that 2.2 million you're talking about, often those figures, that the way they put it in that report, were conflated with other issue areas, funding that went to other groups that didn't even work on oil and gas or pipelines. They were working on fisheries or whatever they were working on. So it's actually, it actually is a lot smaller than that. But in some ways, they seem to have gotten away with it on the war room. Though people should know that despite, as Gordon said, the report not really confirming any of the allegations, then Jason Kenney did come out saying it had confirmed the allegations. And so that's why Stand.earth and Environmental Defense and West Coast Environmental Law, Dogwood and Wilderness Committee are suing Premier Kenney and the province of Alberta for defamation. And we've also filed a request for a judicial review of the way the inquiry was conducted, because we want to make sure that no government ever uses the power of a public inquiry to investigate their political critics again. But both cases are still in the preliminary stages, and they're slowly making their way through the courts. And while I feel pretty confident that we'll win, the fact is that in some ways, didn't they win this round? What do you think is the impact of the inquiries so far?
Well, I think the inquiry in the war room have had an effect. Most people don't look at numbers. If you say, that where the funding was at 2.2 million a year, or it was at 100 million a year, people don't know the difference. And when the report, the public inquiry report came out, the UCP government and Kenney and CAP were saying we're using wrong. They were using a figure of all the money that went into environmental funding, most of which had nothing to do with climate, and they just use those figures. So, and I think my report got no news stories. I don't know why. It should have been a news story. So people don't hear a contrary, much as contrary. So I think it has partly worked. I think it's the message, not just of the inquiry, but of Canada's energy citizens, groups like that, works especially among Albertans and people of Saskatchewan, for whom the oil industry is seen as both a source of identity and as an employer. even though, of course, big oil is demanning the industry. That's their term, demanning. I don't, meaning that they're cutting jobs like crazy. But the identity part is really important. I lived in Edmonton for 30 years. See, I went to the Oilers games. I cheered for the Oilers. So in front of, it's called the Edmonton Oilers, okay? And you get this facsimile of an oil derrick coming down at every game. It comes down and the hockey players skate through it. So there's a really strong, there's that idea that that's part of Edmonton's or Alberta's identity. Now, I just want to say I've designed a new name and logo, the Edmonton Solars. And I've actually got a logo for that. But I don't think the campaigns have done as well outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan. I think it's partly, it partly has taken somewhat. I think least in places like Toronto and Quebec, but I think especially in resource producing areas it has. The mass media is pretty bad in, and sort of not, and there's so few journalists now, I mean, compared to where they used to be, that to do investigative journalism. And the media tends to buy into this whole neoliberal global idea, the market knows best. And Stand.earth came out with 2 reports on phone ownership of their own industry. Maybe there's small stories. No, I want to do another instance of what the media does. In the 1990s, 6 giant foreign-owned oil corporations started what they called the National Task Force on the Oil Sands. And it recommended a sweetheart royalty regime in which big oil would get Albertans oil for free, almost for free. And the Alberta and federal governments rubber stamped it, and it's now still law in Alberta. So it was designed by big foreign oil to benefit themselves. Of the 36 Canadian newspaper stories that mentioned the task force, only 3 said the task force was dominated by oil corporations. None revealed that those corporations were mainly foreign owned. And only 2 noted that Eric Newell, who was the task force spokesperson, but also president of Syncrude, one of the biggest corporations in the tar sands, and also it was also president of the Alberta Chamber of Resources. So this was a totally self-serving thing, and the media did not report that. So how are Albertans and ordinary Canadians supposed to know this? So it's only, through work of citizens groups like Stand.earth and the Council of Canadians and social media and webinars like tonight's that people actually find out what's going on.
And I would add alternative media outlets.
Yes,
I mean, I think in recent years, I've been really heartened to see the growth of the Narwhal, National Observer, the Tyee, these alternative kind of media outlets that are doing some digging. So I would broadly agree with you, but I think it is citizens groups as well as alternative media. Well, but these examples are harrowing, but let's prepare for now. So what's happening now? What are the most important recent changes in the industry's political tactics that we should be aware of right now? And then I also want to ask you, give us a sense of what's happening on climate policy right now and how the industry has been influencing it. So let's talk first about what are the recent changes in industry's political tactics? What should we be aware of that's happening right now?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that big oil knew for 70 years that their emissions caused climate change. And then they just suppressed that research. Then they went into deny. They copied big tobacco. Recently, and saying there's no link, and the link is suspect between emissions and climate change. Recently, they now pretend that they're part of the solution. And they offer all kinds of false solutions. So, I mean, their game is still delay, pump, and profit. So while they delay, they're still making huge amount of money all the time. So they now pretend to be part of the solution. And carbon capture and storage, of course, is a big part of it. So big oil demands that the taxpayer subsidize big oils, so they can continue to emit, and then they're supposed to be taking it out. There's also the net zero is a real problem. All these corporations are promising net zero by 2050. So when you promise something by 20, in 30 years, who's going to hold you accountable? But the net is also a huge problem, because what these corporations are saying is that we can buy offsets. We can find some place that is going to be taking this stuff out of the air, and we can then just carry on as usual. There's also, they talk about carbon intensity. They're reducing the carbon intensity of their production. So, for every barrel that they produce, the emissions are lower per barrel. This, of course, hides the fact that their absolute emissions are rising, and carbon intensity does nothing to hinder climate change, only reducing absolute amounts do. And they've also starting to take over the language of sustainability, and even the climate justice, and give it their own twists. Sustainability becomes not environmental sustainability, but the sustainability of the corporation to make a profit and to continue. And so they talk about a just transition, and they again, this is all, so people will get mixed up. If the environmentalists are saying, just transition, and the oil companies are, well, so those are some of the changes.
Those are huge. And they really undercut, and they run right into this policy question, Tim, because the fact is that we have some pretty bold language and commitments from our governments now. Climate emergency, net zero by 2050. Yet when you dig into the plans, they still allow an increase in fossil fuel production. But yes, somehow we're magically going to get rid of all of those emissions. And it comes back to these questions around CCUS, around tree planting, around bioenergy and land storage of carbon, et cetera. And when I'm working internationally right now, crunching the numbers, we would need several planets if we wanted to have all of the land area necessary to store all that carbon that everyone's planning for. That the scientific reports keep telling us that we need absolute emissions and production decline. In fact, even the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have all said, no, if we want to stay below 2 degrees, no new projects fit. That means no new LNG, no new oil drilling. And that was really the basis for us coming together around the world to start the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, because we know we have enough. We have enough fossil fuels now under construction or on the surface of the planet to use while we transition to renewable economy. And renewables are actually way cheaper now than fossil fuels. Yet we're still on track to build 110% more fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, than we can ever burn and stay below 2 degrees. It's crazy. And there actually, a new report came out just last week, which from the IEA and the OECD, saying that despite climate pledges, government support for fossil fuels in 51 countries doubled. So the subsidies have doubled. So we're giving the industry more and more money, while we're saying on paper that we're getting off fossil fuels, we're helping them stay alive because of these promises of CCUS. I've been saying, Gordon, that they've moved from denial to delusion, that somehow they can continue to increase the production of fossil fuels, but we're going to reduce emissions. Let's look at some specifics of how it's playing out in climate and environmental policy in Canada. Tim, do you have some examples of where they have actually weakened policy or legislation?
And so I want to actually take a step back, because I think this is the right route to go down. But we have this idea that in Canada, oil companies are always totally comfortable with their ability to sort of puppet master public policy. And this wave of citizen organizing that we're talking about, and even this wave of nationalistic focus that Gordon studied so well, really started sort of after the royalty review in 2007 in Alberta, where companies got scared that even a conservative government in Alberta was starting to think, hey, maybe the province actually deserves a larger cut of these profits. And there was a moment there where they were reckoning with the fact that even the people that they thought were their most ardent supporters in government were starting to reevaluate the relationship between fossil fuel companies economically in the government of Alberta. And so this is what sort of sparked this turn towards citizen organizing, this turn towards, you know, a national level focus on these campaigns. I think maybe one of the most underreported or underappreciated stories that we've sort of just come accustomed to with the War Room and, like, you know, dating all the way back at least to the Harper government is the way that oil companies have got Canadian politicians to act as lobbyists for them. That while they are still, yes, investing millions of dollars in lobbying in the United States and in Asia and in Europe to, you know, quote unquote, open markets, oil companies feel relatively safe right now with their ability to pump fuels out of the ground. They are very worried that they're not going to be able to sell them to anybody, that they won't be profitable. That's really where the concern lies. And so I think sometimes when we talk about keeping them in the ground, we need to think about where they're going eventually. And what CAP and other organizations have done is sort of push politicians to do things like start a war room, but particularly to lobby politicians in other places, in other governments, to try and make it easier for Canadian fuels to cross borders and to basically cut Canadian companies better deals. So I think we need to look at, like, outside of Canada's borders to look at where some of the most important policy changes are happening and the sort of informal policy of government lobbying.
Yeah, I've got a great example of how the oil industry got the Alberta government to act as a spokesperson. I don't know if you remember, Justin Trudeau spoke in 2017, spoke to a public meeting in Peterborough, and he told the forum, we can't shut down the oil sands tomorrow. We need to phase them out. We need to manage the transition off our dependence on fossil fuels. This is going to take time. Very reasonable position. But boy, you could hear the noise from all the way from Alberta to Peterborough, Ontario. Just the outcry from big oil and Alberta politicians. And this was the NDP government was in power. And of course, the UCP was they demanded he retract. He got his whole cabinet behind him. And he said, I'm sorry, I misspoke. And he recanted the statement. Then 6 weeks later, Trudeau spoke to big oil executives in Houston. And to strong applause, he said, no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. Now, of course, he didn't say that 97% of those barrels are in Alberta oil sands, and that oil must be left in the soil for the world to have any chance of staying below 1.5 or 2 degrees increase. But anyway, that showed the power. I mean, you know, how many times has Trudeau sort of recanted on him and got the whole cabinet behind him and saying, I misspoke. So that, you know, so there you're getting the government to act as sort of lobby. Also, during the pandemic, and this is in my report as well, CAP got the federal government to form a secretive government working group, industry working group called Create the Path. They had weekly meetings with the Minister of Natural Resources and deputy ministers, and 4 foreign-owned oil companies, Petronas, Cenovus, Suncor, and Chevron. And the government industry committee, their objectives were keep industry active and viable, preserving jobs and encouraging investment, a reduction in operating costs and the regulatory burden, support for offshore liquefied natural gas, and oil sands projects were said to be central to any economic recovery. No mention about climate, and the existence of the committee was not made public. It was journalists digging, you know, who discovered that. Martin Lukash wrote a great story on that. But this is the kind of access. Of course, environmentalists did not have that kind of access to the government. So that, I mean, we're talking about that power. Now, I'm not trying to say that the oil industry is all powerful. They don't win everything, and we can win this, and we will win it with citizen power. But it's important to know what we're up against and how they operate.
That's a really good point. It is incredibly insidious, and they have had a lot of power. And I think, I sometimes though look at it and think of it as the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
They're throwing everything they've got at it right now because they can see the writing on the wall. I have met with the CEOs of most of the major oil companies in this country, and they know. They say, yes, the world's going to use less oil, and yes, we have to get to zero or net zero by 2050. But, if we're going to be using oil, let's hope it's mine. Let's hope it's Canadians. And that is kind of, one of the essential dilemmas, that they're all just kind of pushing to make sure that it's their projects and their barrels that get to keep being used and keep being sold. And I mean, I'm not necessarily against that, using Canadian oil in Canada as we transition out of oil. But the question is, what's the ramp down and what's the plan? And there was that little glimmer of a moment there where Trudeau was acknowledging that we need to ramp it down. And certainly we've heard that from Minister Guilbeault as well. The question is, will the policies, like the details on the emissions cap program, or the details on the just transition legislation that the government has promised, will that actually reflect what they know needs to happen? So right now they talk about emissions reduction, but they do not talk about production decline. Even though we know there has to be production decline, there is absolutely physically no way, and certainly not from a cost competitive experience, but not even from a practical experience, that CCS is going to reduce the emissions enough that we don't have to reduce production. And the longer we wait, the quicker the production decline has to be. And that's the frustrating part of it. Sorry, you wanted to jump in there, Gordon.
Yeah, well, you can see how corporate oriented the Trudeau government is. The emphasis is on carbon pricing that that is applied to consumers. But for the oil industry itself, there is supposed to be emission. They're supposed to be paying a price, but they're exempt from most of it. And
yeah, a lot of people don't know that the oil and gas companies themselves are exempt. Their operations are exempt from most of the carbon price because they got in there and helped design the carbon pricing system.
Right. And so if you had a government that was would take on the corporations, the biggest source of emissions comes from the production of oil and gas in this country. And it's even bigger than transportation. I mean, we've got to make changes everywhere, but the focus has been of the Trudeau government has been on the consumers, and treating them as like this is an individual problem. Is as the individual consumer got to change your behavior. Even though, I talked earlier about how 90 corporations in the world are responsible for something like 2/3 of all the emissions in the world. And so if you really want to deal with climate, we do have to phase out the oil sands. One of my favorite things is to say we should end exports within 10 years, and we can scale down oil for the Canadians, although we're going to have to go for more than 10 years. But we could end exports quickly, and that is over 2/3 of the production and emissions are for export.
That's a really good point. We have so many amazing questions coming in that I really want to get to them. A couple things before we do. First, I want to go back to the political implications here, because obviously we've just seen the Conservatives elect a new leader. It wasn't lost on me that within minutes of Pierre Poilievre being elected, in his when his wife's speech introducing him, one of the things she talked about is how he won't ever hurt normal people's ability to fill their gas tanks with gas. Like that came into minutes of him being elected. Tell me what you're thinking. What are the implications of his win? What are the ties between politicians like Pierre Poilievre on the one hand and CAP and big foreign oil on the other? What should we be looking for in the run up to the next election? Who wants to start? Go ahead. Good, Gordon.
Tim, have you looked at the connections with between Poilievre and the oil industry?
No, not Poilievre specifically, but I think while that's important to do, I'm less inclined to look at the personal connections between particular political leaders than to look at the structure of politics and how it's sort of anyone who's elected as a political leader at this point is in some way beholden to fossil fuel interests. I think of Kevin Taft's wonderful book about Canada sort of becoming a petrostate. The idea that to achieve that level of political success, you actually have to already kind of have some backing from the oil industry. And so, I'm less interested maybe than others and less knowledgeable about how Poilievre's personally connected to the industry than how his party and, the system of government is sort of depending on extractivism.
Yeah, now he's got an image which is on the surface very attractive. But it's important to realize that despite his Francophone name and the Ottawa area riding that he represents, he grew up in Calgary and was very much influenced by the Calgary oil industry and the whole, Calgary is the center of the right in Canada. The leaders of the Conservatives almost all come out of Calgary. And he is, I don't want the other political parties, the Liberals, the NDP and the Green, to concede the working class vote to him. It's totally misleading that this guy who has been an MP since he's 24, really only worked as that, is coming across as a working class hero. And, to defeat the Poilievre Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens are going to have to up their game and learn how to appeal and genuinely represent working class people and show them how the transition is going to benefit them, how the housing, how affordable transportation, how there are better jobs are going to be produced in the transition than in the existing oil industry. But they're going to have to, the Liberals are going to have to get away from their corporate image and their corporate policies. The NDP is going to have to rediscover its working class roots, and the Greens actually to find a working class base. But it's, I do think that the story that that Poilievre and his wife tell is on the surface seemingly attractive. And of course, it's meant to be a contrast to Justin Trudeau, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, son of a prime minister, and I'm just a normal working class guy.
I do think that a lot of it is playing on people's fears, really real fears, about the cost of heating their homes, about the cost of traveling, etc. And we did see him on the campaign trail, talking about banning oil from foreign dictators and, doing a lot of stump speeches at oil events and oil and gas events and equating our ability to drill for more oil with our ability to be free. And it's one of the things that has, as we watch the ravages of the climate emergency across Canada, but also around the world. I mean, the floods in Pakistan that displaced 33 million people this summer, thousands died, the heat waves all across the planet, the fires. It seems to me that we need to find a way to take back the narrative around security. Drilling for oil or more oil doesn't make us secure. It makes the oil profits secure, that's for sure. And certainly we're seeing record profits of the big oil companies. But at the same time as we're seeing record profits, we're actually seeing royalties and taxes go down, and we're seeing jobs go down. So actually, who does it benefit? And from a political perspective, I feel like I'm still waiting for the party that's going to have the guts to actually say that. the health of these oil companies does not equate with the health of the people of Canada and our future. We need to give people energy security, but that doesn't mean that we need to drill for more oil. And we have to find a way to untangle that. And I had naive hopes around Trudeau, and I think that it is I think that it's been very that they've walked into the oil industry's message box, even those who understand and believe in climate change and want to be climate leaders. That the BC-NDP, for example, with the LNG and fracking dramatically increasing and really not putting a stop on that growth either, they reinforce the oil industry's frame. Excuse me. All the time. But let's get to all these great questions. Excuse me. But first, we talked a little bit about what can we do and what are we doing right now. Let's turn to, I got so worked up. Let's turn to the groups who brought this webinar to us. We have Chris from Council of Canadians. You're going to tell us a little bit about what we can do.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Hey, folks, I'm Chris with the Council of the Canadians. I'm one of the climate and social justice campaigners with our organization. And I just want to talk to you folks really quickly about the Flood Parliament campaign that we have ongoing right now. So as you may know, in 2019, the Trudeau government promised to pass a Just Transition Act that would support our transition away from fossil fuels and towards new decarbonized industries. But the government has not tabled any legislation yet. So Council of Canadians has been using a parliamentary petition to push MPs across the country to speak up about the proposed legislation and voice their support. So a just transition would guide Canada's shift away from fossil fuels in a way that benefits workers and communities and protects our livelihoods while also addressing the climate crisis. So we know at COC, and I think many of us here know, that in order to address the climate emergency, we need to wind down the fossil fuel industry and transform other high emitting industries, just as we're talking about here tonight. And when we do that, we'll need to make sure that we provide support for affected workers and change the ways that we get energy, produce food, heat our homes, and move around. So while we make this transition, it's also important that we're protecting people's human rights and labor rights, so we can have a safe and dignified jobs and communities. So in short, our Flood Parliament petition with COC calls for a Just Transition Act that recognizes and enshrines basic rights, including labor rights and human rights, that includes the participation of affected workers and communities, as well as Indigenous peoples, a Just Transition Act that expands the social safety net, creates new economic opportunities, and drives inclusive workforce development. So far, this campaign has been really successful. We've had over 150 people in over 40 communities that have been collecting signatures to get their local MPs to table this Just Transition petition in Parliament. Thousands of people have signed on to our letter to Justin Trudeau demanding just transition legislation now. And thousands more have asked their MP to table our Just Transition petitions in the House of Commons. So currently 48 MPs across the country have committed to doing so, and 32 of those MPs have tabled it already. And we actually have instances of MPs who have tabled it multiple times over and over, which really speaks to the hard work of their constituents. So if you are interested in learning more and getting involved, you can check us out at canadians.org/justtransition. And Dylan, who's the other climate campaigner, and myself would be really happy to talk to you and support you in work to make sure that Just Transition legislation gets tabled and responds to all of those needs that that are articulated earlier. So thanks for the time.
That's awesome, Chris. Thank you so much. So I see in the chat function, if you open it up, I think everyone can see it. There's a link right there. And it is so easy to do because while you were talking, I clicked on it, I added my name to the petition, and I sent a donation to Council of Canadians, just like that. So all of you watching, you could do it too. So we also have with us Sven Biggs from Stand.earth, some other ideas of what we can do and an introduction to some other campaign initiatives. Sven, over to you.
Thanks, Tzeporah. As folks might know, Canada is the only G7 nation that has seen our emissions continue to rise after signing the Paris Accord. That is in large part because of the oil and gas industry. They are our largest source of emissions and our fastest growing source of emissions. So there's literally no way Canada can ever keep its climate commitments without capping and bringing down this important source of climate pollution. So right now, the federal government is considering a cap on oil and gas emissions, and they've put out a very wonky discussion paper with a bunch of options. To save you all from having to read that paper and respond to it, we've created an easy online tool where you can submit a letter into the process that will call for a strong cap on emissions that covers all oil and gas emissions from all corners of the sector, that puts people first, including Indigenous people, and that is based on science. So we can be sure that Canada actually starts to meet its climate emissions. So that the link to our tool is in the chat, and the deadline for these comments is September 30th. So I hope everyone will click on it right now and take a few seconds to submit a comment to the government. Thanks for your time tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Sven. Okay, we're going to move to some questions from the audience now. Graham Duncan asks, what's meant by a renewable economy? Is green growth feasible, or do we need degrowth? Oh, I have so many things to say, but let me turn it over to you guys. What do you guys think? Who wants to take that?
No, I want to hear what you have to say on that one, Tzeporah. Why don't you start us off?
Okay, so there is no definition of a renewable economy, but I think when people say renewable economy, what they mean is a decarbonized economy, an economy that is based on renewable energy, low carbon energy instead of fossil fuel energy. Renewable economy could also mean that all resources used are resources that are renewable. And in fact, we're starting to see a lot more really interesting work around the world on the circular economy, which means let's use what's already above ground. Let's use what, instead of continuing to mine and extract for more resources, which I think is really fascinating. So is green growth feasible, or do we need degrowth? It's not an easy answer, because I think the fact is that we do need the growth of renewable energy. That's the bottom line. If we are going to fight climate change, if we're going to try and stay below 2 degrees, we need more renewable energy, and we need more electrification of transportation. That's the bottom line. And that will mean the growth of those industries. But we also need a significant amount of energy efficiency and conservation. And, do we need to degrow? Do we need to buy less, value things other than growth? It's such that could be so many different seminars, and there's so much good work out there on that. I think the answer on our crazed overconsumption world is obviously yes. And if you're interested in consumption of stuff, there's an amazing book out there that I just read called last year, The Day the World Stops Shopping by J.B. McKinnon, full of facts and so much interesting work on consumption. So yes, in my opinion, we do need to reduce how much we buy and consume. We do need overall for economies less focus on growth and more focus on quality of life. And again, we're starting to see that in a number of places where GDP and growth of GDP is not just seen as the most important thing, but there are new and really exciting studies on what makes good quality of life and how do we include that in our policy making. And there's some great examples actually in James's book on that as well. It's such a big question. Anyone else want to go for renewable economy or degrowth?
Yes, I don't think we should let the corporations and the political right capture the word growth. Growth, because growth is, we have growing plants. We want our children to grow and develop. The growth has been captured as something that is the GDP growth, which really measures just what is profitable. It doesn't measure necessarily, and it measures bad things. If something happens and you clean up pollution, that that's part of GDP, but it's not necessarily part of people's well-being. So I think we can grow, we can, you know, we don't need as much physical throughput. We certainly need much more caring. There's a whole bunch of ways that we can grow what we do, and have a good standard of living.
Yeah, I would only add that like the Canadian, you know, national economy has always been based on the extraction of resources. You know, since before Canada was Canada, whether it was furs and crops, then oil, coal, minerals, timber, and at a level and pace that is not sustainable, where you're steadily over time depleting those resources. And so if we mean something like degrowth, by getting that back to a pace where we're no longer, you know, speeding towards not having those things anymore, or if we're going to step back even further and sort of look at, you know, what were the uses of land before those moments? What were the ways of living in this place that didn't depend on extraction and then export as a financial system, to think a little more radically along those lines.
Okay, I'm going to jump around here. Great question here. Regarding the lobbying of government, do you think that MPs even realize that they're being manipulated by lobbyists? Why do you think they would go along with lobbyists when it compromises their mandate to represent their constituents? Is there any place for MP education in this movement? I wonder if MPs could hear this webinar, if that would change anything. So what do you think MPs, have any of you done any work interviewing MPs? What do you think MPs are thinking? How do they think about these issues? Yeah, Tim, I see you nodding.
Interviewed a couple of MPs. I've also interviewed some senators in the United States. And there was an example when Keystone Pipeline was about to be built in Nebraska, the XL extension, and they were sort of weighing the merits of this, and it was under consideration, where there was an oil lobbyist who was sort of representing a quote unquote citizens group, and he showed up at the offices and was talking to all these senators. And this was a moment for me that was really important. Like, all of these politicians knew exactly who this person was, because they had known him for 10 or 15 years. He had been a lobbyist in the state for a very long time. He'd been working for oil companies for a very long time. There are, again, personal connections and networks. And it's the same thing when I step in, talk to MPs in Canada. They're pretty well aware. And, you know, if you get a form letter that's signed by 10,000 people and they're all exactly the same, you know, letter, it doesn't take long to figure out where that started and to look, sort of backtrace the organization and see, oh, that was, you know, CAP started this one, or someone else started another. So I think they're very well aware, and that typically they're often using that as cover to make decisions that they want to make anyway. The whole idea is they're turning to industry and saying, look, I can't really vote in favor of this bill or in favor of this decision unless you give me what looks like a groundswell of citizen support, because then I can say that I am listening to my constituents. It's not when we held these hearings that it's like packed full of only environmentalists, that we can kind of have this feeling, at least in the public discussion, that there's backing for this position, and then I can vote that way. So I think, you know, rather than listening to their constituents and figuring out what they're saying, MPs are often sort of deciding what they would like to do and then trying to find some facsimile of constituents that will sort of make it look like there's real backing for that position.
Thank you for that. There are also, besides questions, some really amazing information and comments coming in. The Union of BC Municipalities is currently meeting in Whistler for their annual convention. The top 3 sponsors, Fortis BC, CAP, and Coastal GasLink. A breakfast is sponsored by Trans Mountain. This is Graham Duncan, a group of physicians have written to the UBCM executive about how inappropriate this is and sent copies to MLAs and MPs. Good for you, physicians. Thank you for doing that. That is awesome. That is the kind of thing we see all the time. It's somehow shocking to me still that the UBCM could be just so publicly doing it. We're just funded by all these companies. Our event is, our annual convention is funded by all these companies. Okay, on jobs. How much are people influenced by the fossil fuel companies' argument that they need to continue to preserve the thousands of fossil fuel sector jobs? So is that narrative that they're creating working, and is that really influencing people, the whole jobs piece, which, just so people know, the data shows that it's the exact opposite, that the industry over a period of 20 years has dramatically increased their oil output. They've decreased the amount of jobs significantly. And while jobs are dropping, profits are rising, but royalties are decreasing, while liabilities, how much the taxpayers has to foot to clean up the mess, is increasing. So the data actually doesn't reflect what they're saying, but what they're saying, is it working for a lot of people? The jobs, this question is the jobs a narrative working?
I think that people have a more inflated idea of how many jobs the oil and gas industry produces. They partly look at GDP, and when you look at it as part of the GDP, it's way bigger than the number of jobs. It actually takes $2 million in the oil industry to produce one job. And within the manufacturing, you get 10 times as many jobs, and in services, 10 times as many. So the actual number of jobs is really falling. Jim Stanford had a great report on this, about how much this is dropping. But I think people have an overinflated, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, overinflated idea of how many jobs are actually produced. Even directly, or even some of the ancillary industries, is still less than 1% of all Canadian jobs.
Yeah. So I think that's been the go-to argument in Canada and in the United States. I sort of spend a lot of time down here as well. And that's not an accident. I think coming out of Gordon's report, one of the things we see is that the people running these campaigns are working for multinational firms, and they often share knowledge across those borders. And so in 2015, when CAP was sort of just getting their grassroots citizen mobilization off the ground, they invited Derek Spooner, who was at the time the head of communications for the American Petroleum Institute, to Calgary to speak to oil executives and folks at CAP. And he sort of laid out the south of the border grassroots strategy that they were using down there, which focused very heavily on this rhetoric of, supporting industry so that you don't lose your job. But I will say that folks on the ground, that resonates very strongly with people, in part because a lot of them have lost their jobs. In a boom and bust economy cycle, they have gone through periods of long-term unemployment and real strife. And so, this idea that if there's no boom, then it's only bust, is very concerning to them. And so how can we sort of convince them that there will be some other form of employment waiting for them? But I would also add that the flip side of that is a lot of people who enter these campaigns and start becoming really prominent in them, the folks I talked to whose faces were on the CAP campaign, often feel kind of uncomfortable about it because they're worried that they won't be able to be hired outside of the industry now. That by being the face of oil and gas, all of a sudden you're going to be toxic if you try and apply to a job outside of oil and gas. And so some of these activists who, especially as they rise to positions of a little more prominence within these campaigns, begin to worry, am I, tying myself too firmly to this one industry that's in a precarious position?
So let's stick with the jobs piece for a bit. There's a lot of questions and almost comments around, so what do we do? There's one question about, well, what about how do we grow worker co-ops and social businesses to constrict billionaire greed? There is another question around, well, wouldn't educating the employees in the oil industry about alternative energy sources and alternative employment allay their fears about losing jobs, and that would create a problem for big oil because they'll all move to the renewable energy jobs? Couldn't that work? So there's a lot of questions around, what do we do? There's a final question in that kind of same category. Dealing with climate change is seen as risky to the economy. The average person equates economy with the current version of the economy and thus their security. People worry that tackling climate change risks their food, clothing, and shelter. But there are new models of the economy that are safer and perhaps even better. How do we change this perspective? So when people hear economy or jobs, they don't equate it with fossil fuels. So on some of those, on some of those solutions, educating employees, workers, co-ops, how do we change that narrative? Who wants to start?
Well, remember Tzeporah, you said that facts don't necessarily convince people, but I'm going to start with a fact here, which is, I think this is the first year around the world that the renewable energy sector has more jobs than the fossil fuel sector. And as people see that growing, it should become a reality to them. There are more jobs that will be created in conserving a unit of energy than in digging it up and emitting it. There are so many jobs. You know, I think we have to talk very much about conservation, not just renewable energy. We use almost twice as much energy as Western Europeans do per capita, and they have more efficient transportation, more efficient homes. There's an incredible number of jobs. These are much more labor intensive kinds of things to do than in the extractive industries. And so you would have to you have to have government that will have programs that are going to help people with the transition. People shouldn't just have to do it on their own to be thrown out there. Money that's going to help them to retrain and go back to school. If they got a family, they still got to pay all the bills.
So, I mean, the first thing I would say was just like yes, yes, and yes to all of those comments. I think it's not going to be a silver bullet situation. There's not one option here. We need a sort of many approaches way of dealing with this stuff. But I'm a communication scholar, and I think one of the things that's very clear to me is it's really hard to change people's minds. And instead, it's easier to get them to act on values and beliefs they already have. And I think that's the brilliance of Gordon's report, is that rather than shouting down, sort of oil campaigns, he's saying, oh, you're making this argument that foreign funding shouldn't be in our politics. Yes, I agree. And here's what we can do about it by sort of limiting the spending of CAP. And Tzeporah, you were sort of making a similar argument before, I think around energy security. Instead of saying like, no, that doesn't matter, say, energy security absolutely matters. And here's what it might look like. Here's what actual security might look like that would get us away from boom and bust cycles, that would get us away from the precarity of depending on a couple of pipelines as like, an economic hub for the entire nation, a more distributed sort of solar or wind energy platform, whatever sort of other approaches you want to bring into it might be more secure. And so can we talk to people through their own language a little bit? I think that's really important. And seeing where and when to do that in the existing sort of fissures that are showing in oil's base of support. We've barely talked about the Convoy today, but the sort of protests that started around United We Roll were meant to be sort of pro-pipeline, pro-energy infrastructure, and very quickly became this wildly xenophobic, racist sort of, anti-immigrant campaigning. And there's a lot of people in the oil sector who are very turned off by that and afraid of it and want nothing to do with it. And so can we see these moments where the base of support for oil is having these really deep disagreements, and can we find the people who might be open to talking and hearing something new? So I think it's not only about the actual ideas that we're bringing to the table, but how strategic we are and who we talk to and how.
I think that's a really good point. I think there really is a piece around meeting people where they live, and I think what the far right is doing, they're doing really well, which is again, as you said, they're recognizing people's values and then building on them by motivating them to engage with them, right? And I remember when I was on that oil sands advisory panel, I had a conversation with a woman who was a mayor of a northern Alberta oil town, and about climate change. And it was our first meeting, and she said, I know, you're the climate activist, and you're going to try and convince me that climate change is happening, and I don't even think you should bother, but I know this legislation is happening, so I want to be here and help make sure it's good legislation and blah, blah, blah. And it's okay. And we decided that the whole advisory group should go out to dinner together to get to know each other, because we're trying to make consensus recommendations. So I'm sitting at dinner with her, and I said, so, when you're not doing this, what are you doing? And tell me about what your interests are. And she said, oh, I'm a farmer, and my family's had this farm for so long. And I said, oh, and do you notice changes in the weather or your growing patterns? And she starts going at the droughts and the floods and how the changes in the weather patterns and they're like from her lived experience. And I didn't connect it to I just sat there and listened. And then at one point she goes, oh, wait, are you saying well, I mean, I guess it is because of, and then she said, do you have any studies you can send me for me to take a look at about climate change and how it's changing agriculture? And I said, sure, I'll send you a couple links. And I sent her a couple links. A couple meetings later, we had a totally different conversation. And it was just this moment of realizing that, you know, instead of kind of like the preaching, I was just connecting. And then it was a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
I want to also point people to two other pieces of resources. There's a great group called Iron and Earth. I can't remember who asked this question about educating workers, but Iron and Earth are workers. They're oil and gas industry workers who are not just trying to create education about the need for renewable energy and the opportunity it has, but also retraining. Really cool group that's doing some, I think, really important work. And on issues around the stats and how we find them, so we can, I'm not saying facts don't matter at all. Of course, we need a basis in facts. I'm saying we also need to connect with people's values, and we need to back it up with good organizing. The fact that this information gets out there and your report doesn't is not just because they've got better framing. It's also because they have better architecture. More social media accounts that are drawing people in, they have more knocking on doors, etc. It's the grunt work of social change is the organizing. But anyways, on the facts that look at how big is the renewable industry in Canada, what is the potential for renewable industry, I always turn to Clean Energy Canada. I think they do some incredible work. I put both links in the chat. Now I'm talking fast because we're ending. It's already 5:29 at all these other comments, questions that I wanted to get to. But I think we're going to have to leave it there. Gordon, Tim, is there anything that's burning that we missed and you're like, oh, I should have mentioned that for people to look at or made this last point?
I think the last thing I'd say is just we often, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, talk about the industry like it's this big cohesive whole. Like these people are all on one side. And I think, Tzeporah, Gordon, you've stepped into these roles a little bit. They're not. I mean, some of their disagreements are economically irreducible. They're like, some are invested in natural gas, others in tar sands, others are moving towards more renewables. And so they're not going to fundamentally always agree on things. And some are very small Canadian companies, others are big multinationals. Their interests really aren't always the same. And so rather than like, always sort of lumping industry together and seeing them as a whole, there's a lot of internal disagreement that goes on. And a lot of that happens behind the scenes. Talking to people at CAP, a lot of them never wanted, the companies themselves didn't want to do the grassroots strategy at all. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming into it because they were so afraid of like reaching out to people. It was really CAP that was directing that. And so just, I think, as we sort of critique industry, to again, look for these disagreements within it and see like where we can make use of those in these conversations.
Thank you, Tim. Gordon?
Yeah, that's very good. It's my ambition in the next year to close a huge loophole in Canada's Election Act. So after the 2016 US election, in which there was Russian meddling or allegations of Russian meddling in that election, Canada changed its Federal Election Act, and it forbade foreign entities from intervening in Canadian elections and spending. But they left a huge loophole, and they included foreign corporations. But if the foreign corporation was headquartered or said it was headquartered in Calgary, then they were considered Canadian, and they intervene, and CAP intervenes in a big way as a third-party advertiser in these. And I want to start a campaign to close that loophole and say that it is foreign owned. And this is the basis of how you understand whether it's a foreign influence corporation. 5% for a foreign government shareholder, 20% for a single non-government foreign shareholder, or 50% total foreign ownership. I'd like people to go away from tonight to realize that the oil industry pretends it's Canadian. It is overwhelmingly foreign owned and foreign funded, and we should get that message out there because I think it would help to cut a lot of the legitimacy that they have.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of questions in the chat about, can I get a recording? I'm going to say yes. To those who signed up, we're going to send out the recording. Sorry, people at Council of Canadians, I just made work for you, as well as the saved chat, so you can get all of the links. I'm assuming we're sending those out. and I want to end with this. You know, these issues are complicated, and climate policy is complicated, but that's part of how the industry exploits that to decrease our own engagement in the solutions that are absolutely critical at this moment in history. There are 200 of us, over 200 of us on this webinar. And if we all commit to getting out there in whatever form we are comfortable with and making sure that our elected officials know that we want increased ambition on climate change, don't let the complication hold you back from doing that. The fact is 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere causing climate change come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. And we know that we need absolute emissions and production decline, and that's what you need to ask for. The graphs just have to go down. It's really not that complicated. Our politicians need to know that there are consequences for their inaction, and that there will be support if they make the hard choices to do the right thing. There isn't a more important thing that we can do at this moment in history. So if you're comfortable with it, dust off those placards, bring out those chains, do what you're comfortable with all the amazing groups who started this webinar, Council of Canadians and Stand.earth. Thank you. Get out there and join those kids. It's Fridays for the Future in marching. Make sure you send your check to the groups, but do more than that. Commit to a couple of hours. Send a letter to your MLA. Send a text to your MP. Better yet, go down and visit their office. Let them know that this is an issue that's important to you, because it's important to all of our futures. Thank you so much, Gordon and Tim, for all of your research. It's so important, and for taking the time out to explain it to all of us today. And thanks to the folks that organized the webinar from Council of Canadians. Have a good evening, everybody.